You also touched upon earlier, business change, and businesses are thinking about how do we go from here. Now, one of the questions that we get is, the rate was reduced, and there's been a host of changes, but is this permanent? I mean, it is permanent, but can this change in 5 to 10 years? If we're making significant business changes like moving IP to the U.S. or having a bigger footprint in the U.S., companies want to know that there's some certainty to this change.
Yeah, great question. So when we think about the original intent of the law, it was about U.S. competitiveness. It was about, if we want to be and show that we're more competitive, that it will last. So when we think about the certainty of U.S. tax reform, it has been passed in law. It took 31 years to get to this point, and it took 31 years because you needed to make sure the House, the Senate, and the President all agreed on, again, a common bill that became law. As we consider the provisions that you've just mentioned, whether it's the rate, whether it's interest deductibility, and the other elements of corporate taxation, those are permanent. They do not sunset. So those items can't change unless you end up having a new law that is passed in the U.S. There are elements of this tax law that are temporary, but they're primarily on the individual side, and they sunset at the 10-year mark.
Yes.
But when I think about business and investment, they should remember we have the corporate law that is now in place, and that will not change until somebody else has the ability to change it.
And also, in the near term, the law has come out, but I think there's still some uncertainty as to the application, the interpretation. We still have to wait for Treasury guidelines. We still have to wait for accounting guidelines. When should we expect those types of guidance?
Yeah, that's a great point. So we ended up having, let's put it this way, tax reform took 5 years to plan and then get done, but we had a sprint from November through December. And that was a sprint.
And 500 pages of law.
That's exactly right. So we have 500 pages of law without regulatory guidance for the most part. Similarly, all the financial accounting boards had to find a way to start interpreting it as it was built in place. So let's talk about what we're going to do in understanding it and there being guidance. We already have had some initial guidance in the form of a notice from Treasury that came out on the toll charge that relates to the deemed repatriation. That fact that we had a notice within 7 days, that's amazing. That type of response is critical. And what's been happening is the Treasury's actually been reaching out to different tax professionals like our firm and others to say, what is most important when you think about this guidance? Where do you need more detail? Where do we need to be, and how do we need to be prioritizing that regulatory guidance that you and your clients will need? I do expect that there is going to be a very substantial and aggressive effort to get these regulations that are associated with key provisions out as soon as possible, but it's going to be quite voluminous. Okay, I cannot say when that will be ready. I just know that the IRS understands it. They have to administer this law, and so it's just as important for them as it is for taxpayers. On the financial accounting side, you've already had 2 different important events occur. So you had the SEC issue some guidance around the fact that they know that taxpayers don't have certainty around many of these provisions and how they're interpreted, or the way that they should be accounting for them necessarily. So under an SEC bulletin, they ended up indicating that companies will be able to account for this type of unusual activity or this tax reform, right, within the year. Very similar to when there are large acquisitions. What's also happened, though, is the Financial Accounting Standards Board met last week, and they've already begun to look at some of the critical elements of tax reform and provide guidance to companies as well as the accounting firms as to the proper treatment. I think you can expect that over the next few months, and frankly, over the next year, you're going to see an accelerating pace of guidance coming again from the tax authorities as well as, the different financial accounting standards boards.